Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you back to the final debate of this term, and my pleasure in a moment to step down from this chair and to take part in the final debate of term. Before I do, I'd like to introduce you to the new committee who will be taking over from this team for next term. I'd also like to just congratulate the winners of Friday's election for Easter term. Easter term president will be Joel Fenster. The executive officer will be Emily Gittins. The speaker's officer will be Imogen Shun. The treasurer will be Steve Squirrel. And the social events officer will be Lucy Lassman. But to use the expression of a personal friend, the wolf closest to the sledge is to hand over from this term to the next. Matej Jovanovic, on my right, has been social events officer this term. His efforts have brought to you what has probably been the most fun term in my experience here, and we thank you for that. Matej will be handing over to Natalia Mai. Natalia's not here, but thank you, Matej. Joel Moss has accomplished the impossible as this term's executive officer, making sure the union runs smoothly day to day and keeping the rest of the committee sane. Joel will be handing over to Joanna Moped. Casey Swerner, this term's treasurer, has made record sponsorship, which on its face doesn't seem to mean much, but what it means is that we've managed to keep membership and bar prices down, and for that you have Casey to thank. Casey will be handing over to Anastasia Bokatereva. Thank you, Casey. Anna Stansbury has been this term's unstoppable speakers officer, bringing you what is unquestionably the most diverse range of speakers a term has ever seen. Anna will be handing over to the capable hands of Alex Porter. Thank you, Anna. I have massively enjoyed my time here, and I thank each and every one of you for that. And it is with pleasure and honor and excitement that I'm happy to step down from this chair and hand over to the more than capable hands, shoulders of Benjamin Kentish, President of Lent 2013. Well done. Well done. This is going to do an awesome job.
Thank you, Austin. I know I speak for a lot of people here when I say Austin has done a truly fantastic job as president. This society owes so much to you, Austin, and is so much of a better place because of what you've done. Together with Anna, Matej, Joel, and Casey, you have put on a term to remember, and I'd just like to say on behalf of all the committee, everyone involved in the union, all members, well done, and thank you for what you've done, basically. We do go on with the debate. We do also have a debate tonight. Let's guess that's why some of you are here. So we will crack on with that now. The first speaker, as always, on the proposition in his presidential debate is Austin Mahler, a third-year lawyer at Tithall and outgoing president, as I've just said, of the Cambridge Union. Austin.
Benjamin. Trinity Hall. We were there 200 years earlier. We're going to be there 200 years later. Before I begin the actual debate, which I know is why you guys are here, I do... You're a disaster! You've just sat down! You want me back up there? No. To Ben, I have to respond because Ben has underplayed his own role in this term. I would not be standing here today if not for his support and friendship. Ben has been a mainstay of my time in the union for the last 2 years, and I will sorely miss working with you. But it's not just Ben who's sat me down when I was going crazy or stood me up when I was feeling low. Alex Forzani, the silent vice president who has sat through tolerating my rantings for the last term and a half, 2 terms, has been a phenomenal support. He's got his own company to run, and yet he's managed to spend more time than could ever be imagined making sure that I was happy, that the team I worked with was happy, and so the union has an enormous amount to thank you for. As well as the other student officers, the staff, the people who keep this place running day to day. I know you guys came here for a debate, but the fact of the matter is this place wouldn't be here without them, so I have to mention them. But the one group that never really does get mentioned, that never does get the thanks it deserves, are the members. Because this is your society. You guys made this term and past terms and future terms happen. Maybe you don't know how, maybe it wasn't clear, but on every debate form of the last 2 terms, there have been feedback forms on the back. And because of what you put on those forms, we put together this term. We put together a term created by you. Now I think this term there has been more criticism of the union in recent weeks that the union hasn't taken its members' views on board, that it doesn't do that enough. And I agree, it doesn't do that enough, and we can always do that better. The union can always do that better. But this term, it's become clear that this is your society, this is our society, and each and every one of us can make some difference to make sure our voice is heard. That's what free speech is about. Free speech is about everyone having a level platform, no one voice being privileged among the voices of others. I know I've said it a million times standing up there, but I'm going to quote one of our college representatives, whose name I'm going to use now. I won't use their name because I don't think they would be happy for me to. Okay. I have to thank Sarah Garland for putting it in these words. Free speech is for everyone, not just those who can talk over other people. And that's what free speech means, that everyone's voice is given equal weight, and that everyone's is put on an equal footing. Now I think that slides perfectly into tonight's debate, because what tonight's motion is, this House believes that hate speech is not a human right. Now this side of the House isn't proposing that free speech should be limited. This side of the House believes that free speech should be, that the only voices which should not be given weight are the voices which would silence others.
Exactly.
I've already got my side on board, now I want to get the rest of you on board. Now, so I'm happy and proud to propose tonight's motion. I'm going to look at it in 2 parts. This House believes that hate speech is not a human right. That's the motion. Hate speech is not a human right. So first I want to look at what we mean when we say human right, and then I want to look at what we mean when we say hate speech, and show you that one is incompatible with the other. That not only does hate speech not fall under the blanket umbrella protection of free speech, hate speech is a limit to free speech. And to prevent hate speech doesn't restrict free speech. To prevent hate speech fosters free speech. So I'm going to look at what we mean when we say not a human right. We're talking about free speech. That's it. Plain and simple, run-of-the-mill free speech. Ideas, voices should not be restricted. Perspectives should not be restricted. That's what free speech is. I think we can all agree with that. Now, it's a typical debating move to say that you've won the motion before the debate even starts. And so I'm going to say, let's pretend for a moment that the European Court of Human Rights got everything right. And they've deemed that the laws restricting hate speech are in concordance, that's not the right word, the laws restricting hate speech fall within the European Convention of Human Rights. Therefore, we've already won. It's not a human right. However, taking for argument's sake that the European Court of Human Rights got it wrong, what is free speech? What's the point of free speech? The point of free speech in a democracy, arguably, is progress, is the ability to question those in authority, the ability to say, I believe those leading us are wrong. If free speech is withdrawn from us, if the authority that is can say, you don't have a right to criticize us, they become authoritarian and they cease to be representative of the people's views. If you want a leadership that represents the people's views, you have to hear the people's voices. But free speech, I said it's about progress. It's not just about democracy. Because the first voice of dissent, in some places they call that rebellion. I believe here, as I said, we call it progress. The first voice of dissent, the one that is disagreed with at the outset, years down the road will become the majority voice. Somewhere, there was the first scientist to propose a paper on global warming. Somewhere, there was the first scientist, Charles Darwin, to propose a paper on evolution. Somewhere, there was a scientist who had the audacity to break with convention and say that the Earth moves around the sun and not the other way around. Shocking blasphemy! No, free speech is the right to say what everyone else thinks is wrong. And that cannot be restricted. And this side of the House does not propose that that should be restricted. So before the other side of the House even gets up, I just want to begin by saying, if they say we oppose the Western liberal democratic idea of free speech being unrestricted free speech, no, we don't. We would never say. Yeah, he agrees with me. There we go. we would never say that. What we're saying is that hate speech is a blight on free speech. Hate speech restricts free speech. So now, in whatever time I have left, because Alex isn't very good at showing me the time I have left, but I'm sure he'll cut me off. What do we mean when we say hate speech? What is it that we say doesn't fall within this idea of progress? Hate speech is any voice that would silence the voices of others. Now, probably tonight you'll hear a lot of definitions thrown around. You'll hear hate speech referring to racial hatred. You'll hear it referred to sexual hatred, sexual oppression. You'll hear it referred to religious oppression. But the simple idea, it's not about religions, it's not about genders, it's not about race. Hate speech is someone getting up and saying, other people, the weaker voices, don't have a right to be heard. That's hate speech. We had a speaker who was supposed to speak tonight, as some of you may know. A man formerly of the British National Party, British Nationalist? BNP. He resigned from the BNP and began the BDP, British Democratic Party, arguably because he felt the BNP wasn't fascist enough. He was going to argue in opposition of this debate. Need I say more? But I will say more. The simple matter is, people oppose fascists not because they say things that we're uncomfortable with, but in the open letter that the NUS sent to me asking that we revoke his invitation, their words were, and I'm just going to read directly from this, "We should always remember that the millions of people who died at the hands of a Nazi slaughter in the gas chambers and the concentration camps did not die because their debating skills or their arguments were not powerful enough. They died because once fascism had abused the democratic system, and now I'm running off paper, once fascism had used its ability to have its voice heard, to silence the voices of others, it soon closed down any freedom to present any resistance." That is what this side of the House opposes. This side of the House opposes any perspective that would silence the voices of others. By all means. That is a very good distinction you make. Thank you. And I'll answer no, we're not. We do not propose silencing the voices of people. We propose silencing a single idea. A person should have the right to speak. A person should never be sold, they cannot speak. We only say the one thing they cannot say is that other voices should not be heard. Because every human being has something to contribute to this discourse. Every human being has something for which they should be heard. So this side of the House isn't proposing to limit free speech. This side of the House is proposing to protect it. And for the first time ever, I'm going to close a speech before the time runs out. I'm simply going to say, if you allow hate speech to be a human right, you allow, slowly but surely, individuals such as fascists to restrict that right to no one but themselves. If you believe that speech should be free, if you believe that your voice should be heard and that your voice should be as powerful as my voice or his voice or her voice, propose this motion agree that hate speech is not a human right?
Nicely done. Job well done, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Austin, for that. To open the case now for the opposition, we have Suvi Junzo. Suvi. Suvi is a first-year politics student at Newnham. Suvi.
Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition, you oppose the Western liberal democratic idea of free speech. Yes. This House believes that hate speech is a human right. This motion, opposing this motion is so important to me because I know exactly what it means to have freedom of opinion and freedom of speech in society. Coming to debate here today, I want to assure the proposition and the audience of one thing. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Anything that you have to say to me here today, to anybody, is your right, and that includes that of hate speech. The definition of freedom of speech is that we allow every single opinion to flourish within society. If any of you in the audience here today wish to say anything abusive to me, please be my guest. As introduced, the definition, I have to say the proposition didn't quite introduce the idea of free speech, or hate speech. Hate speech is the use of words that are deliberately abusive, they're insulting and they're threatening, and they're calculated to stir up hate amongst vulnerable minorities. I'm here, you're there, so I'm a minority. I'm unarmed, so I'm vulnerable. This motion is so important to me because of my religious background. I wouldn't be here in Cambridge studying today if I hadn't critically thought about the opinions that were given to me or imposed on me, and to think for myself of what do I believe, and to voice for myself what I believe in coming here to this institution. The proposition bench speaks about hate speech. They're trying to characterize it and dehumanize the people who are the hate speakers. I'll take it in a minute. They want you to visualize a group of men with white robes and pointed hats and their eyes cut out. And they're the idea of hate speakers who are just imposing on vulnerable minorities. But they want you to shudder and feel like you're in the 1950s. There's a group of men that are opposing the civil rights movement, as if hate speakers only have a bad agenda. But they don't. Hate speakers have just as valid an agenda as anybody else who's speaking in society. They don't point out that minority opinions, hate speakers, I'll take you in a minute, I'll point to you. They don't point out that minority opinions and hate speakers speaking in hatred of a vulnerable minority, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing for somebody to be able to have a voice that dissonates from all the rest. For example, in Germany, so when you have the Nazis, there was a White Rose group of these young students, and they had their philosophy teacher, and they resisted basically Nazi Germany in the face of death. And they were all beheaded in 1943. And they opposed the majority consensus. And this is another opinion. And what they were doing may have been considered hate speech by people who really regarded the Nazi ideology. Hate speech is something that's really subjective to what you're saying, to the context of the situation. Hate speech is a critical part of our society. But what I want to tell you here today is how important it is. My emphasis here today is freedom of speech. There's no limit that you can put on freedom of speech. It has to be absolutely unrestricted. This is from Christopher Hitchens in a debate at Hart House. He said, it's not just the right of the person who speaks to be heard, but it's the right of everyone in the audience to listen and to hear. And every time you silence somebody, you make yourself a prisoner of your own action because you deny yourself the right to hear something. I don't understand how a proposition bench can sit there, and in a moment I'll get to, yes. I don't understand how a proposition bench can sit there, advocate the right of free speech, but then put a contingent, or put restrictions on it. You cannot restrict free speech.
On that point. Well, no, hang on.
Okay, no, go ahead.
we're not talking about dissent. We're talking very specifically about hatred. And I think what the people here will want to hear from you and your side is what you consider the intrinsic value of hatred to be in the progression of our society and the world.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you exactly. Actually, I'll use the words of John Stuart Mill. He's a philosopher. So he's another dead white guy. John Stuart Mill refused to come to the University of Cambridge. He refused to come to the University of Oxford because he thought that the Anglican Church had too many rules imposed on the university. So he refused to come to these places.
Doesn't sound like an answer.
Instead, he left to join his dad at the East India Company trading opium. But he's one of the greatest writers in philosophy. He writes about the freedom of speech, and more importantly, about the freedom of all speech, whether it's hippie love speech, the one extreme of love, that the way of peace is the way of love, or whatever hippies say, or the other extreme, where people have extreme hatred. These two extremes are what balance freedom of speech today. Without these two extremes, you cannot have freedom of speech. It's the definition of freedom, is that you have all freedoms. No, I'm not taking you. But why did he feel so strongly about this issue? Because our society seeks progress. Progress requires truthful knowledge, and in order to have truthful knowledge, you need all opinions. Free speech is truth generative. So here's the logic. First of all, any opinion in the world has a possibility of being true, no matter how eccentric it seems. Hate speech, extreme love speech, all opinions have the possibility of being true. Second of all, few opinions have the whole truth. So you have a bunch of opinions, not all of them are entirely true, not all of them are entirely false, most of them lie in the middle. So you need a range of opinions. Third of all, when the opinions are conglomerated together, they're going to cancel each other out, and you'll finally have a more accurate truth. This is what philosophers, political scientists have said for all of history. It's the same thing you do when you write 5 million essays every term. You research a whole ton of stuff, and then the stuff that overlaps and it seems most conclusive is what the closest truth is. This is why the extreme of hate speech is so important. We need free speech because the opinions that are circulating around our world today are what bring us to progress, right? Well, I want to balance it. I'll give you this metaphor. So we have the political science Tocqueville, the political scientist. He was a French political thinker. He went to the United States to check out what democracy looked like in the 1800s. He went to the US. He saw that within the US there was a ton of newspapers. He looked at the newspapers. He's reading each one, and he's like, this is bullshit, this is bullshit, this is bullshit. So each of the individual opinions of the newspapers are just garbage. But when you put it together, what he said is that and he wrote this in his book, Democracy of America, is that ultimately what happens when you have such a range of opinions is that cancel each other out and you end up with the truth. And this is the reality, is that freedom of speech requires all levels of speech. So you have the extreme of love, extreme of hate, all the middle opinions. And what's going to happen is the strongest opinion is if everybody is able to voice their opinion, you'll have such a mass of opinions that you will find the closest thing to the truth as long as you're considering all the extremes. But the minute you cut off any part of this range of freedom of speech, you don't have freedom of speech anymore, and you will not find the truth because you've distorted the cycle.
At that point,
Go ahead.
you argue that a balanced extreme, and coming towards the middle seems to be the pragmatic sort of view of...
It's not a middle. Sometimes the true view will be over here. But it's the held opinion.
View in any political, especially in the US, we can see this quite easily when Bill O'Reilly seems to say tide goes in, tide goes out. You can't explain that. Versus
in the US, okay, thank you. No, I got your point. Now here's the thing, is that what has happened today is our freedom of speech has already been damaged. So we don't have, for example, broadcasters. So if we all had newspapers and journals, that's fine, and people can express their opinions through newspapers and journals, that's perfect. But what's happened today is we're controlled by broadcasters. So we have people that are the private interest groups who control broadcasting groups. So that's obliterated our freedom of speech. What we are looking for is an ideal society where we have newspapers, a range of opinions, and they cancel each other out, and they bring the truth because when you have these incomplete truths and you put them all together, they become a conglomerate of one free truth.
But surely to curtail the freedom of speech of these private broadcasters would be to curtail freedom of speech.
That's what I'm saying. You don't curtail the freedom of speech of private broadcasters. You make sure there's enough freedom of speech. Right now it is restricted. And that's the problem, and that's why opposing this motion is so important. No, just sit down. Freedom of speech. So another thing I want to point out about in opposing this motion is that it's completely impossible. So imagine I'm the Queen of England, right? I'm coming here today, and I'm never leaving the throne. I don't have any real power. But anyway, I'm going to tell you this. I'm just going to, for the scenario, that dear people of the United Kingdom, I have decided, okay, I'll do the voice. Dear people of the United Kingdom, I have decided that from this day onwards, you may not use words which are deliberately abusive, insulting, or threatening, that are calculated to stir up hatred against members of vulnerable minorities. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So people will just laugh. When I went to search up the royal family on Google, it was like their student room, and the first 10 captions were, "We hate the royal family." And then there's 43 thumbs up under each one. So people so hate speech is part of freedom of speech. It's part of the balance that brings us together and makes sure that our society proceeds and moves forward. Because the only way we can have any progress in society is to make sure that all opinions are brought to the surface and that we can consider every opinion when we're, yep, got it. We can consider every opinion when we are making our judgments and moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to Sophie for stepping in at such short notice too. Next up on the proposition side, we have Rupert Myers. Rupert is a barrister specialising in civil and commercial law, and also a journalist who's written for The Telegraph, Guardian, and Daily Mail. Rupert.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I've had to abandon most of my preparation for tonight's debate because I understood the motion was that this House believed that we do not have the human right to hate speech. So I wrote a lot about audiophobes, people who are generally quite antisocial, and the fact that no one can really understand what really people with deep Scottish accents are saying anyway. Progress, ladies and gentlemen, is monkeys with typewriters. Eventually, some good will come of it. Progress is allowing the noise to consume us, and every so often we might hear something meaningful. Alexis de Tocqueville, you don't have to even read, because apparently everything he saw was bullshit. We, in proposition, say that it is never right to speak to one another with hate. I'm here to say to you that therefore hate speech cannot be considered to be a human right. You're going to hear some very duff ideas tonight, not all of them in the next 10 minutes. And one of the problems, other than the fact that bad philosophy always collapses upon contact with the real world, may be that the people speaking in opposition to this motion don't know what it's like to be on the receiving end of hate speech. I know a little of the anger in men's hearts. I've been the victim of abuse. I've worried for some time before tonight about whether I should discuss the sorts of language that was employed, especially because it's being filmed, but it seems necessary to share with you what people say when they want to convey their hatred to a fellow human being. I've been called a Tory. I've been called a lawyer. It's all true. At most, though, I'd like to hope that those sentences are just offensive. Let me say at the outset that we think that we should be allowed to offend one another. I speak as someone who regularly receives offensive comments, both on the bottom of my articles and on Twitter. It's the cost of doing business. It's the price for a free society. There's something quite valuable about having readers remind me that I look like a child, speculating about my success with women, delighting in the name Rupert, sometimes calling me Woopert for fun, and expressing dissatisfaction with my face. It pricks the bubble of my ego, particularly when I've just written something that I think is the greatest gift to literature since Tintin or the King James Bible. Your sympathies are doubtless going to lie with giving the most expression possible to the most number of people. Mine absolutely do. But there have to be limits, and the expression of hatred is one of them. We know that laws are not there to change what is contained within people's hearts. Certainly not the ones with whom we disagree, but we cannot stand by whilst harm is done, and in doing so hide behind empty principles. Because limits, rules, they give substance to freedom that they contain. They give shape, form, and strength to freedom, and they allow it to endure. This great institution, the Cambridge Union, rightly tests the limits of free speech, and it's with great courage that your president and former presidents invite people to come and to speak here. And I'm proud to be a member of an institution which challenges all of its members to listen to and judge the views of everybody, however morally questionable they may be. But Austin, it's clear that your time is up as president, because they've started using your business cards as the name place tags at the dinner, which clearly suggests that there are still too many of these knocking around. Bad ideas, ladies and gentlemen, deserve the scrutiny of public debate, which is why I'm so happy that all three of the opponents to this motion will be addressing you this evening. Today, in light of what's been happening in Leveson, we've heard a lot of very overblown language about the freedom that newspaper owners demand to run newspapers in whatever way they choose. They make those claims, by the way, on the basis of the same principles being addressed here tonight. You'll hear my opponents talk about the unintended consequences of regulation, the unintended consequences of trying to do the right thing, but this is scaremongering, because we've seen in the newspaper industry what the consequences of not enforcing rules and laws are in the name of free speech. Free speech itself is a misleading name for what we have here in this country. It's not true, almost anything that the first speaker in proposition said to you. If you wish to slander people on the internet or in newspapers, you'll discover that lawyers will come running to your door. If you wish to plot an act of terrorism, you'll soon discover that there's no such thing as free speech. You cannot brandish lists of people you've Googled and think might be pedophiles on live television. If you wish to break the Official Secrets Act, you will discover that there is no such thing as free speech. If you wish to breach copyright law, you will discover that there is no such thing as free speech or confidentiality, because there are rules that confine, constrain, and give meaning to the idea of freedom.
On that point,
yes?
it doesn't follow that because there are some restrictions on freedom that we don't have free speech.
I'm coming to it. I'm coming to harm. I'm coming to why we say that hatred, specifically, should be limited. Hatred is blind, inveterate anger. I don't even have to define hatred, because they're the ones who want to make it a human right. But I will do. I will say that. It is an emotional response. It is irrational. It is all-consuming, and it is destructive. Leaving aside those difficulties of defining it, which are theirs, why not protect it with a human right? Well, firstly, we should dislike the idea of laws as telling us what we may do. I prefer laws which take as their starting point the basis that we can do whatever we like, and then define a discrete number of things that, for sensible reasons, we have curtailed, rather than laws that pretend to grant us rights and to tell us what the state thinks we're allowed to do. If philosophy tells us what we should do, then law tells us what we must not do. If philosophical ideas are the yellow signs on the highway, laws are the red ones. So human rights specifically protect fundamental aspects of our existence and flourishing as human beings. They embody and they preserve elements of what a lot of people call the golden rule, that we should treat all people equally, and that we do so because that is how we would wish to be treated. Protecting hate speech, as I'll come on to say one moment, is incompatible with that fundamental principle. Yes?
We're not talking about protecting physical violence.
No, hate speech. Hate speech. Hate speech. Speech itself is an evolved process. Language, social intercourse are the necessary preconditions for peace and for prosperity, and thus there are established rules to our freedom of expression. I've mentioned some of them. They do for freedom of expression what the laws of property do for freedom of movement. You can't violate the intellectual property of someone as much as you can barge into their house. The law gives structure and meaning to the idea of freedom of movement. There are rights of way, there are access over land, and there are caveats and defenses in copyright legislation. Ownership would be meaningless without the crime of theft. Privacy would be unenforceable without the laws of trespass and confidentiality. Words, ladies and gentlemen, can harm. Voltaire also said that to pick up a pen is to be at war. The value and the power of a word to discriminate and to wound is understood by all of us in this room to a greater or lesser degree, and I struggle to think of an example that wouldn't be offensive to anybody. So I picked marriage, just the word marriage. A lot of people in this country, politicians, priests, journalists, argue about the use of the word marriage because a civil partnership is, in everything but name, a marriage. But they argue over the word. They argue over the word the way that Rosa Parks argued about where she sat in the bus. Words have meaning, they have symbolism, and they have power. But so why restrict them? Any of them? Well, because we don't want to allow harmful and corrosive behavior in our society. Why would we only restrict physical harm? Why would we only restrict each other from hitting one another and not restrict from wounding one another, from upsetting one another? We know, don't we, that words have that power. There's a lot of empty rhetoric about sticks and stones, but we know that words can be used to destroy people's confidence. Yes, go on.
Who's going to arbitrate which words cause harm and which words don't?
This is the best question. And the answer to that question is a very clear one. We're never going to get a fixed set of agreed rules as to what is offensive and harmful and what is not. That is why you do not protect it with a human right. That is why you allow the courts over time, and as our social norms evolve, as we as human beings change in our interactions, you allow groups in society to say, actually, this is no longer criminal. The point about a human right is that it is fundamental to human flourishing. The point about hatred is that when you experience it, it causes you fear, it causes you upset, it limits your horizons. You lose your confidence. You don't go out at night if you feel you're in an area of people who would do you harm. I have stood amongst a fascist rally in Hungary this summer with a friend of mine who was black and saw how she recoiled in terror and would not go out that night because of the people who were there. Harm isn't necessarily physical. Terror can hurt. And for those reasons, why on earth would you want to embody it in a human right, which would go against the dignity of the individual, the privacy and the right to respect of the individual, and give in on the grounds of a lofty, empty principle that means nothing unless we give it rules and body and structure? This idea of freedom of speech. I want real freedom. I want freedom for everybody, not freedom for hatred. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I meant opposition. Sorry.
Thank you, Rupert. Our next speaker is Mike Karras. Mike is Head of Advocacy at Index on Citizenship and also a Vice Chair of the Solutions Council. Mike.
I just had sort of, it was a good... Absolutely bollocks.
Hate speech, but they don't want to define it. Well, it falls to us to define it. Now the problem is, this here, this is what hate speech looks like. This is Azeri opposition newspaper, As Our Look. If you go to Baku and you want to buy a copy of this, you walk into the newsagent, you say, can I have a copy of As Our Look? And the guy will look at you, slightly askance, and then he'll go into the back, like he's sort of retrieving hardcore pornography. And he'll come and he'll present you with this copy, and he'll look and check there are no secret police, and then you get your copy of As Our Look. This is, according to the government of Azerbaijan, hate speech. It's hate speech because, according to the government of Azerbaijan, it does down the president. Now, across the globe, there is a conversation about what is hate speech and what isn't hate speech. From the Innocence of Muslims film through to David Starkey using a fake Jamaican patois accent on Newsnight, there is a debate about what hate speech is. And unfortunately, for this side, a lot of hate speech is part of the fundamental right to freedom of expression. A lot of it is protected by Article 19 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The little bit of hate speech that is not protected is direct incitement to violence in the context where violence is likely. So no one on our side is going to defend Rwandan radio that...
She would, on that point. She said that there should be no limits to free speech.
I don't think that's true. I think there are contextual limits.
She said.
Hang on a second. We are not defending the right to incite genocide. But the problem of your side is you're saying hate speech isn't a human right. Now, for the people that fall into your category, at the moment, right now, they are put in prison, right? Or they are fined by magistrates. I'll give you an example. Gurpreet Kaur Bhatti, her play Bejti, 2004, Birmingham Rep Theatre. This is a feminist Sikh minority playwright. She put on a play, and at the heart of the play is a scene where a woman is raped in a Sikh temple. Now, lots of people in the Sikh community stood up and said, this is hate speech. This is inciting hatred against our community. And so 400 men went outside the theatre where her play was being performed, and they stormed the theatre, and they said, shut down this theatre, this is hate speech. And when the play was shut down, Home Office Minister Fiona McTaggart, when it was shut down, she said, this is a victory for freedom of expression. A minority playwright writing about the subjugation of women in her community, having her play shut down was a victory for freedom of expression. Now, it's nice that we've got these academic arguments. It's nice that we're talking about hate speech in this kind of theoretical way. But right now, there are people being prosecuted for hate speech and people ending up in prison. I'll give you another example. Harry Hammond, 69-year-old pensioner, a God-botherer. Used to walk around the streets of Brighton, and on his, a God-botherer, you know, a very, it probably is. That's what I'm here for. And he had this placard that says, Jesus gives peace, Jesus is alive, stop immorality, stop homosexuality, stop lesbianism, Jesus is Lord. And in Brighton, as you can imagine, it didn't go down too well. So he's walking around the streets, this slightly eccentric old man with his hateful words, and a big group surrounded him, and they said, you better fuck off, right? And they pushed him around, and the police came, and they arrested him. A magistrate fined him £300. Now, by the time it got to the county court, he was so nervous with stress, he died. This is an eccentric old man. And what your side doesn't realise is there are people in Britain today who are prosecuted for offensive hate speech.
On that point, exactly what I was saying is the people who silenced him are the ones who should be prosecuted, not the man carrying the sign.
But then your argument falls down, because your argument is hate speech is not a human right. And the issue that we're debating is, should some hate speech be protected by Article 10 of the Human Rights Act? And our side is saying,
what hate speech is.
Well, you haven't defined what hate speech is, and maybe you'll do that in a minute. But so we're saying Article 10 of the Human Rights Act does protect, not all, but does protect pretty much most hate speech. It protects offensive speech. It protects rambunctious opinions. And, yep.
Are you seriously calling a man who called for people to stop homosexuality and stop lesbianism a rambunctious opinion? That I'm not straight, and I don't think that's a rambunctious opinion. I think that is a direct violation of my human rights. Thank you.
Do you think that he should be prosecuted? Do you think an old man should be prosecuted and put... This is the crux of the argument. This really is the crux of the argument. Do you want to live in a society where I would say we've made huge progress in the area of gay rights? And the way we've done that is we haven't taken every single bigot and stuck them in prison. What we've done is, in our society, we won the argument. We fundamentally won the argument about gay rights. We fundamentally won the argument about women's rights. What we didn't do is say to every racist old bigot, do you know what? Your hate speech, we're gonna stick you in prison. It's about that. So what the UN Special Rapporteur has said is quite clear. He says the extremist groups, and it's a shame the BNP aren't here tonight, because actually it would have been a much more punchy debate. But UN Special Rapporteur says extremist groups have been attempting to hijack the freedom of expression debate and cast themselves in the role of the ultimate defenders of free speech. I've campaigned against the BNP in Dudley, and you speak to people on the doorstep, and they say things like, do you know what? I like the BNP. They're people that stand up for free speech. Or, do you know what? I feel that I can't say what I feel like saying anymore. There's too much political correctness. It's a real issue. If we... Yeah.
Do you genuinely believe the BNP has something constructive to say about our society?
No. The answer is very, very simple. It's no. But if we attempt to silence the BNP and EDL, we do their job for them. If we say that... If we say that hate speech is not a human right, we feed their victim mentality and we allow them to claim they're a part of an establishment plot to silence their right to freedom of expression. We shouldn't silence the BNP, we should expose them to free speech. We shouldn't censor the BNP, we should give them the rope to hang themselves with.
You don't have a human right to wear that tie, but you're allowed to. Why do we need to make it a human right to be this obnoxious?
Right. Going back to first principles, right? So you've got Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, okay? So we say there is a right to freedom of expression. If we're going to have this right, and this is the point about extending it, so it covers things we find offensive, it covers things we find insulting. Currently, English law, as it stands, criminalises speech that is insulting or offensive. But the point is, your side, the bit of the debate that you're on actually wants to extend that. Now, what we've got to sorry. No, but you do. And the issue is, and I think the issue is you cannot lock up everyone who propagates hate speech in a world where every single person in this room can publish a blog at 3 clicks of a mouse. Free speech is the best way to fight hate speech. If all of us took it on as our job to take on free hate speech wherever we find it, whether online, whether in our communities, it will do a lot more than fining people and locking people up. And what we can't have is an academic argument where we don't recognise the fact there are people in prison right now for committing hate speech crimes. And often those hate speech crimes are for insult or offence. The law is wrong. I've run out. This is... How long have I got? Yeah, well, I'll take a point, yeah.
By all means, then I might invite you over to our side, because you're saying exactly what we are. We would not criminalise the person who says something offensive. We would criminalise the person who tries to...
Oh, now I've got a minute. But No.
Our definition of hate speech.
Your definition is wrong. Right. It's very simple. Unfortunately, your definition is wrong, right? Hate speech is defined in law. You're on the wrong side of the debate. Hate speech is seen as something that causes offence or insult to a self-defined community. And the fact of the matter is, your side needs to accept that there are people in prison today for hate speech, and actually most of them shouldn't be in prison. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Now, this is the point of the debate where everyone gets to have your say. We'll take speeches in order of proposition, opposition, and then abstention. If you'd like to make a speech, please wait for a microphone to reach you before you start speaking. State your name and college, and keep your speeches, please, to a maximum of 1 minute. Does anyone, to start, have a speech they'd like to make in proposition of the motion? Down there.
I just have Tarini, Homerton College. I just have a small point to make, which is everybody here so naive as to believe that hate speech ends with speech? Speech leads to action. It's the most obvious. If speech ended with speech, then the Taliban will still be speaking. Come on, think about it.
Thank you. A point in opposition? No.
Frederick Labocki, Associate Member at the Law School. I think the propositions motion is a wonderful example of sort of 1984 type doublespeak. What we have here is the idea that if we ban people from saying it, then we abolish the idea. It seems obvious to me that whether or not people say hate speech, they may believe it. And why should we go about believing that since they can't say it, it doesn't exist and everything is all right? We should address these things. We should address it in the open and defeat it. And if we can't defeat it, then we should start thinking about the problems of our society.
Would anyone like to make a point in abstention? At the front there.
It's just a small point directed really at the Cambridge Union Society. I feel that Austin has invited this, well, we came up with the Julian Assange issue, and I'm very aware that one of the comments that we were aware of at the time was, the Union seems to have given Assange just about enough rope to hang himself, yet Austin seems to be on this side of the debate, and I question why.
Do you want to answer that, Austin? After the next round. We'll go back to proposition. Any other point? Yep, down there.
So, if you stood up in the 1950s and said that Ted Loveday, Gonville and Keyes College, if you stand up in the 1950s and you say to people, I think that gays and lesbians should have equal rights to straight people, there would be a large proportion of the population who would find it seriously offensive and insulting to their beliefs. The point is that members of the arguments on the proposition, it's very easy to criticise views and say that they shouldn't be allowed when you happen to agree with whatever the social consensus is in your society. And we're lucky that many of us do agree on many of these things. The point is, for members of the proposition, if the boot's on the other foot and views which are absolutely wrong are considered acceptable, and views that you consider right are very, very offensive, why should you judge their rightness or wrongness by how many people are insulted by them? Isn't truth and justice more important than this?
Thank you. Another point in opposition, please. Over there.
Ellen Quigley, Claire, not Claire Hall. I just have a practical point about this. Like, I don't like hate speech. No, none of us here does. But it's actually easier to keep tabs on those who make terrible comments on the internet if they know that they won't be arrested for those thoughts. Then we can kind of keep track of them. Sorry, pardon?
Anders Breivik. You're suggesting that if people are free to be offensive, then we'll catch them before they commit mass murder.
Well, I actually have a different example, and that's the thing. We have to kind of work within examples here. Yeah. But in Canada, we have a group of crazy skinheads. I'm glad we know exactly where they are and what they're doing.
You'd know where they were if they were in prison.
What they're doing.
They'd be in prison. You'd be able to go, they're in that prison there. That's the prison where we put the skinhead racists.
You can't keep anyone...
Who wants to kill us.
You can't keep anyone in prison for life for saying anything. And that's true, even if you... So, the best case here...
Oh God, this debate has become awfully muddled.
Anyway, sorry, we've gotten into a debate. I'll leave it at that. But practically speaking, it is better to be able to keep tabs on people who say terrible things.
Thank you. Anyone like to make a point in abstention? At the back there.
Tom Watson, Clare College. I think the problem with this debate is one that happens fairly regularly at the Union, where both sides fundamentally are arguing exactly the same thing. And what both sides seem to be saying is that the absolutely paramount thing is to protect the right to speak of the people who can't rustle up the biggest angry mob or a secret police unit at 10 minutes' notice. And this whole debate seems to hinge on the definition of hate speech. Protecting freedom of speech, no one's going to argue with that. I'm not entirely sure that we have much of a debate.
Thank you. Another point in opposition, please. That was abstention. Does anyone have a point in proposition of the motion? Yep, down there.
Emilia, Newnham College. It seems to me that you can't adopt a position of absolute relativism. You can't say that there are no things good or bad. So if there are bad things that might happen to people because of hate speech, we have to control it in some way. And so you can't just say that, it's a nice idea of having speech unrestrained completely and, everyone can say whatever they want to, but there are consequences. And I'm sure no one would agree with, not everyone would agree with the idea of objective morality, but I think that we do live in a world where there are good things and bad things, that everyone would agree that there are good things and bad things. So, so I think hate speech should not be a human right.
Thank you. Do we have another point in opposition now, please? Lots. We'll take one down there.
Thank you. Nicholas Hulbert, Keyes College. So what I think we've heard from the beginning of the debate on the proposition side is that we should have these limits to what we can say and what we cannot say based, at first we had this idea of progress and how free speech hinges on this idea of progress, and hence, according to the analysis we've heard, we have to place this limit on what we can speak to ensure progress. And then later on, when the gentleman was asked how these limits would be set, he basically accepted that those limits would in some sense have to be set arbitrarily by society. Now, I understand the notion of freedom and the notion of free speech and the notion of a free society in general to be one where nobody tells me what I have to believe, and one in which, on the basis of the evidence presented to me, I can come to my own conclusions. And so I have this question for the proposition. Who are you to define my progress? And who are you to set limits on what I can say and what you tell me I can think? Thank you.
Another point in abstention, please. I offered you your right reply. Well, after this, then.
Harry Peto, Clare College. I'd like to make a point about the definition of hate speech, because I think, Austin, maybe you would be on the other side depending on this definition of hate speech. Thank you. I think that you tried to say that hate speech was this idea that if you stop other people speaking, then you're committing hate speech. I'm not sure that's actually the definition of hate speech. The definition offered by this side was to do with offence. And I think that when it comes to offence, it's incredibly hard to actually sort of set a clear boundary to this. And the second speaker said that we need to have sort of rules and boundaries to promote free speech. And I think the trouble with this is to do with this line drawing. Like, I might be extremely offended by your favourite flavour of ice cream, for example, but then there might be a black man who can go to a KKK meeting and be perfectly fine and not mind about anything they say and, be secure in himself. And so I don't think that you can sort of say, just because some people will go home and cry and some people won't, we need to ban that kind of speech, because you simply can't define what that speech is. You never will be able to. And I shouldn't be able to stand in a court and say, I was upset by him, therefore he should go to jail, because I can get upset by anything, really. And so, you might as well say anything, it doesn't really matter to me. We might as well defend free speech, because there's nothing that you can sort of say that is hate speech and that isn't. Any speech can be considered hateful, and if someone thinks this is hateful, I'm very sorry, but I don't think that I should go to prison for it. Thanks.
Thank you. Austin, would you like to reply directly, quickly, please, to the point over there?
Alex, your Red Sox are hideous. Now that is not an example of hate speech. And this is a perfect opportunity for me to explain what I meant by my definition of hate speech, because I agree, in some sense, with the opposition. The right to insult someone isn't in question here. What makes the difference between insulting someone, for example, Alex's hideous socks, and hate speech is the fact that hate speech doesn't allow for opposition. Hate speech is insult taking advantage of power. So on that definition of hate speech, that's the definition I'm going by, that's the definition I'm proposing, that's why I'm on this side of the house. Because I don't think you could give points of information on a rebuttal. I don't know, it's Ben's call. But I'll hand over the microphone in a moment. But that also answers your point. The line drawn between insult and hate speech isn't the effect it has on the victim, so to speak. It's on whether or not the person speaking allows for opposition, allows for contrary view to be presented. That's the definition the proposition is going by. That's the definition of hate speech, which we do not believe is a human right.
Thank you, Austin. We will now return to our main debate, and closing the case for the proposition, we have Michael Levinstein. Michael is a graduate of both the University of Pennsylvania and Oxford, a current law student affiliated with Trinity, and an author of 9 books on subjects ranging from poetry to politics. Michael.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's an inimitable pleasure to be speaking before you this evening in this, the oldest debating society in Britain, committed to the precepts, the world, the precepts of free speech and open discourse. And it is auspicious that the very principles upon which this union was founded almost 2 centuries ago are those which we are debating tonight. For on the side of truth, justice, and enlightened reason, the proposition shall be now and has been arguing that hate speech is indeed not a human right for reasons philosophical, legal, and practical. Now, there's been quite a bit of muddying of the waters in tonight's debate, and it will be my task to clarify it for you, and I shall. And it may at first blush appear unbefitting that an American, in this case the second, be speaking on the side of the debate tonight, for we all know how Americans love their free speech and unlimited constitutional freedom to hate one another blissfully. But consider my defection from the majority of my countrymen only further support that I am endowed with assurance in the merits of our side in tonight's debate. I know that we are all meant to love one another, and that there are some people in this world who do not love their fellow brothers, and I hate people like that, but we must move on, and so I shall. In this speech, I should like to take you on a journey chronicling the philosophical and historical evolution of the phenomenon that is freedom of expression, and why hate speech does not fall within this most essential of human rights. I'm convinced that each of you shall have no other choice but to, in light of the exquisite logic and moral conviction of our side of the House, to vote in favor of the proposition. So without further ado, let us begin, and let us finally clarify what is meant by a human right. It is that moral consideration owed one by virtue of his or her mere membership in the human community. Freedom of speech is one of these essential rights. We grant that, for it recognizes that the dignity accorded human autonomy cannot be respected unless to the expression of individual viewpoints and ideas, of which are most precisely and intuitively communicated through the medium of speech. But speech in this sense is therefore an extension of our autonomous will, our thoughts, and it may even be considered a form subtly of action. Accordingly, it is a right which exists clearly, but not unconditionally. One exception, therefore, is hate speech, herein defined as communication that vilifies a group on the basis of racial, ethnic, national, gender, or sexual characteristics. It includes speech, but also conduct, whose purpose is to incite violence and prejudicial action, and this is an important distinction to draw. Already we find the grounds, therefore, from its exclusion as being not simply a human right, but also morally unacceptable. Let's go further. Hate speech pits the fundamental freedom of expression as had by each individual against his equally important freedom from unwarranted harm and abuse. It is a freedom whose oxygen is to limit and curtail the freedoms of others, and in this sense, it is an unjustifiable freedom. Now, the opposition has said that this is a problematic model that I and my predecessors have drawn, that it's a slippery slope leading to the curbing of liberties, whereas they should be allowed to flourish, however distasteful, because we must always err on the side of respecting individual expression over stifling it. After all, who is to say that we are in the right to suppress the views of any other? But unfortunately, this is nonsense. And I stand before you in this chamber, convinced with every iota in my being, that whereas we must respect every man's view of the world, we are not so naive to believe that those views are all equal in merit. We may each be entitled to our own opinions, but not to our own facts. And it is hate speech which necessarily relies on false facts, divisive language, and bigoted ignorance to procreate itself. No, thank you. It may be that the lion's share of responsibility is on those who act upon hate speech, which incites their violence more than the speaker himself, but the speaker, premeditatedly aware of the function of his words, is morally guilty nonetheless. And international law seems to agree with our side. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states that any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitute incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence must be prohibited by law. Similarly, while the right to freedom of expression is recognized as a human right under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as cited by a member of the opposition, this article actually goes on to say, if you read it, that the exercise of these rights carries special duties and responsibilities and is subject to certain restrictions when necessary for the respect of the rights of others and their protection. Yes?
The Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression of the United Nations says we should not criminalise or censor hate speech unless it is a serious and extreme instance of incitement to hatred. Your speech so far has been so broad. Your side says you wouldn't want anybody in prison, but you can't even categorise where speech comes into hate speech and thus should be defined by a prison sentence.
Well, call me pedantic, but using your definition, I would think that hate speech incites hatred. So I don't see how anything I've said is problematic thus far. And looking in Britain, several statutes, such as the Public Order Act of 1986 and the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act of 2008, criminalize hate speech on racial, religious, and sexual orientation grounds. No, thank you. And any communication which is threatening, abusive, or insulting or intended to harass groups targeted on these bases. The penalties for these crimes, as has already been mentioned, include imprisonment as well as fines or both. The struggle, though, between free speech and its appropriate limitation, it's not a new one. In fact, it's a tension which has unraveled itself throughout the centuries in this country and especially even at this very university. The notion that the expression of dissent or subversive view should be tolerated, not censured or punished by law, developed alongside the rise of printing and the press. In 1644, John Milton, author of Paradise Lost and other light classics, and a Cambridge man, I'll have you know, published his Areopagitica, a response to Parliament's reintroduction of government censorship of printers. In his work, published without governmental approval, Milton made an impassioned plea for freedom of expression, and let us recall his immortal words, "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely, according to conscience, above all liberties." And 2 centuries later, in his magnum opus on liberty, John Stuart Mill similarly argued that without human freedom, there could be no social progress. But even Mill conceded that the only instance in which free speech could justifiably be suppressed is in order to prevent harm toward others, has now famously invoked harm principle. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will, writes Mill, is to prevent harm to others. And it was not until the close of the Second World War that another Cambridge academic, Sir Karl Popper, wrote of the dangers of excessive tolerance of free speech in the open society and its enemies. He argued that unlimited tolerance inevitably leads to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, he writes, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. We should claim the right to suppress the intolerant, for they may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument, claiming it is deceptive, and teach their disciples to answer arguments by use of their fists or pistols, but not by reason. These arguments should prove more compelling now than ever, especially with the advent of globalization and the rise of internet communication, where anyone, no thank you, anytime may post unverified statements which have an instant and worldwide audience. Prohibitions on hate speech must not languish in the wake of the behemoth that is the internet and its seemingly impossible regulation, but instead more robustly upheld now than ever before because of the sheer danger that this new medium poses to their protection. How then to sum up, ladies and gentlemen? We have heard of the importance of free speech, its centrality in the foundation of human rights, which have typified our modern understanding of the rights afforded to every individual, regardless of his national, racial, or any other identifying factor. But it would be a mistake to consider this right unlimited, for little in life is that straightforward. Some may say that they feel uneasy drawing a line limiting the exercise of a human right to any extent. But I would say this to you. Would you rather that line, however imprecise, still be drawn or absent altogether? If you value liberty and the sacrosanct rights to both freedom of expression and that freedom not being infringed by others, if you value a society which respects the autonomy of each of its citizens to the extent that none may interfere or harm any other, if you value truth over falsity and do not recognize that the freedom to spread hatred is a valid freedom, then I implore you to vote for the side of the House. Thank you.
Did you have a very quick rebuttal, David?
I find this concept so amazing that we're so willing to devalue what hate speech is. Hate speech is a critical opinion that we need. Who else is going to hold people accountable to what they do than the hate speakers? That is what the role of hate speech is to hold people accountable. I mean, Muammar Gaddafi, George Bush, hate speakers are such a critical part of our society that I cannot believe that this proposition can even support this idea.
Only 20 minutes.
Thank you, Sammy. To close the case for the opposition and to close the debate tonight, we have Nigel Warburton. Nigel is an author and a senior lecturer at the Open University, as well as a philosopher. Nigel.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here in the spiritual home of free speech, defending free speech against people who want to do it down. Why are we here? Philosophical question, perhaps. But it seems to me that we're here to debate, to argue, to engage with ideas. That's why we're here. But we're also here, perhaps, to have our prejudices challenged, and more importantly, I think, to express our own opinions, things that we genuinely believe. I think some of that's been lost. A very important aspect of freedom of speech is the freedom to express what you actually believe. Some people debate playing devil's advocate. Some people can't define hate speech. We've had a very interesting form of Humpty Dumptying from Austin. I hesitate to say embarrassing. Maybe it was an act of bravado. But the idea that hate speech is simply putting down somebody who's weak. I mean, we seem to have missed the point of what hate speech is. Hate speech, as it's usually defined, is a kind of speech which is deliberately intended to harm people psychologically, perhaps by picking out a feature of the group to which they belong. It's not just a matter of putting down people who can't speak for themselves. As a defender of freedom of speech, I take the view that even those people who would silence us deserve freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is such an important thing. You cut people out of it and you become a tyrant. It's a weapon of dictatorship. So, I promise you I'm probably going to offend some people in the room at some point in this speech. And that goes with the territory. I mean, that's what freedom of speech is about. Free speech means freedom for the thoughts you despise, as well as the ideas that you love. No. Free speech is for free speech is for bigots and idiots. As well as for us. Free speech is for everyone. It's for bigots and idiots as well as for us. Free speech is for bigots and idiots as well. I said that 3 times.
The speaker.
Is it my choice or not?
Yeah, you can tell me to shut up.
Please shut up.
Nigel, would you like to
It's a little bit ironic.
I like irony. Irony is a very important aspect of freedom of speech, actually. Yeah. Look, causing offence obviously isn't sufficient grounds for censorship because, as one of the speakers from the floor eloquently pointed out, I mean, you can be offended by almost anything. Someone somewhere in this room will be offended by something that I'm not even aware of as being offensive. Yeah, I'll take that one. Well, that may be. Thank you. That's what we tend to. I mean, I don't want to get too philosophical, but what's happened quite a lot here is people have come up with stipulative definitions of hate speech, which overlap with each other, but we haven't got a clear target here. That is one aspect of hate speech. You deny people dignity. You deny them their rights as a citizen, perhaps. But I would argue, along with my fellow speakers, that this is best met by counter-speech or by ridicule. You know, ridicule works quite well. Go on, ridicule me.
You haven't addressed what I explained it later to the audience, which is that we don't have free speech. There are many legal fetters on our free speech for good reasons. You seem, on your side, to ignore the potential to avoid harm with those.
Okay, thank you. I'll take that. But that's a very good point. Thank you for that. Look, there's a confusion about what freedom is here. Political freedom isn't about license. It's not the ability to do anything at all. It's always restricted in some senses. I agree. There are issues about copyright. Slander, there are a whole range of things. I'm not going to defend the right of somebody to publish on the internet a recipe for a dirty bomb. I'm not going to defend the right of somebody to publish something advocating paedophilia. I'm not going to, please sit down, I'm not going to defend the right of somebody to incite violence. I don't think that's the point, as John Stuart Mill, one of my favourite philosophers, pointed out. Can I just finish what I'm saying? As John Stuart Mill eloquently pointed out in his description of an angry mob outside a corn dealer's house, waving these placards that said, "Corn dealers are starvers of the poor." We might say bankers are starvers of the poor today. You know, you wave this placard outside, or lawyers, waving this placard outside a lawyer's house could be an incitement to violence. It's context dependent. It's not just the words that you utter, because those same words uttered in an editorial in the New Statesman or whatever would not constitute an incitement to violence. The point at which you draw the line is incitement to violence. It's not hatred. Rupert gave a definition of hate speech as expression of hatred. Well, surely a Jew in Nazi Germany, if they had any freedom of speech, would have said, you know, I hate Hitler. I absolutely hate Hitler. I want to express my hatred for Hitler. Are you saying that was a bad thing, that they should have had their hatred somehow curtailed? You know, there are many things in the world that we hate. If you've got any passion whatsoever, suppressing that hatred is a bad thing. You know, it's going to come out somewhere else. I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with hatred. There are many things that we should hate. I hate Jimmy Savile. Right, so if you're on the side of free expression and of debate, as I presume most of the people here are, you should be opposing this motion. No, I've got some more to say, so you can come back at me later.
While you're waiting to say it, let me just point out, you wouldn't advocate.
What I would like to say is that I've worked with, recently with a podcast, making a podcast about freedom of speech, and talked to some people who have had their freedom of speech severely curtailed by people who thought that they were hate speakers. I met Zarganar, a Burmese comedian and poet, who was sentenced to 59 years in jail for mocking the military leadership. He served 4 years in solitary confinement, was tortured brutally, and came out actually with dignity as a human being. He's a passionate defender of freedom of speech. I want to be on his side. He was put in prison for expressing hatred. I've met Natalia Kolyada from the Belarus Free Theatre, treated extremely badly by the dictatorship there for uttering views which were considered hate speech. You know, you look at what's happened to the Pussy Riot. They're being put in one case, one of them is in solitary confinement, and her crime was hooliganism, but motivated by religious hatred. We haven't talked about religion very much, but the crime of blasphemy is a classic example of the suppression of hate speech. And it seems to me that we've done very well to get rid of a blasphemy law in Britain. It's a terrible thing to have a blasphemy law. Nobody's beliefs and symbols should be so protected that they're beyond, immune from all criticism. That's absolutely terrible. Do you want to prosecute Richard Dawkins for expressing hatred of religion? You know, as an atheist, I find it extremely distasteful, the notion that somebody who actually challenges other people's beliefs should be prosecuted for that. So, how long have I got? You haven't waved at me. 3 minutes. Well, some of you might think this sounds as if it's an easy case. I don't want to pretend that it's an easy case. I think you could have given a much better case for the proposition, actually. Look, in passing, the example of the Rwandan radio is mentioned. In that case, there were absolutely vile broadcasts going out as a prelude to genocide. There were people saying, cut down the tall trees, squash the cockroaches. There were directly inciting violence. And those quite rightly could have been prosecuted as incitement to violence. But before that, there was petrol poured into the country, as one of the commentators put it, that was just waiting to be ignited. That was the petrol that is the kind of wave after wave of expression of hatred. Now, that seems to me is a classic example of hate speech, and it's a difficult thing for somebody who believes in freedom of speech. It's a challenge to me. Can I really defend freedom of speech? People on the radio uttering vile things about the Tutsis, that was a prelude to genocide. And that is the difficult case. And what I think you have to do is look at minorities which are being persecuted, which are being abused through legitimate freedom of speech, and watch very carefully in the context to see, is this really an incitement to violence, or is it just an expression, is it just a matter of personal self-expression? I think organisations like Index on Censorship are very sensitive to this. So it's not a black and white case, it's a whole series of gradations. Okay, you might think, shut up, you ginger cunt. And as far as I'm concerned, you can say that. You can think it, you can say it, you can put it on your blog. I won't like you for it. I hope people will meet that with counter-speech. We need to meet speech with counter-speech. We need to meet rant with refutation, insult with ridicule. But let's not police, gag, and stifle speech, even if some of that speech is filled with hate. Let's disinfect it with sunlight. If the haters are out there, let them come into the open so we know who they are and what they're saying, how close they're getting to inciting violence. Don't martyr them. Don't force them to fester underground. Let them expose themselves for who they are. I don't want to pretend it's an easy issue, but if you're for debate, for free speech, for the values of the Cambridge Union, oppose this motion.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you very much to all our speakers. That is the end of the debate, but it's certainly not the end of the evening. We have our end-of-term party in the bar with live bands and some excellent drink stills. So please do head over there afterwards. As ever, the door by which you leave is significant. Eyes to the right, nose to the left, and abstentions down the middle. All that's left for me to say is thank you very much to Austin and his officers, the appointees, the committee this term, and everyone that's helped out with the union event. And most of all, thank you to everyone who's come, and have a very happy Christmas, and I look forward to seeing you all next term.